With this one easy landscape, 2 paints, 3 brushes, you can learn 4 of the fundamentals of watercolor painting. Welcome to the watercolor workshop. The drawing is really easy. I used a straight edge on a piece of card to draw the horizon, and some wavy lines to represent the hills and the mountains in the distance. I'm using a nice big soft wide brush to wet the top half of the paper. Make sure to get a nice even coating so that it's evenly wet everywhere, and come down below the line at the top of the mountains. Now I've got some ultramarine blue. It's nice and wet. I'm just dropping it into the sky area. I'm trying to apply it with as few strokes as possible. That's the second colour, that's Payne's Grey. I've got my paints mixed in a little jar off to the side. Once the paint's been applied, I try not to go over it. I just try to apply it once and then leave it to soak into the paper. So the paint's quite wet, quite fluid, and of course the paper's wet. This is the wet in wet technique. This is one of the fundamentals that you'll need to learn. You can see that as the paint settles into the paper, it spreads very softly. There are no hard edges. Everything's soft. I'm leaving some white areas. When it dries, they will look like clouds, hopefully. The secret to skies is not to do too much. You can see how fluid everything is when I tip the paper up. It just runs down the page. Okay, back to flat now. All the painting's done on a flat surface. And here it is completely dry. It looks like a sky. Now we're on to the fundamental number 2. So again, the paint is wet, but this time the paper is dry. Not surprisingly, this one is called wet on dry. This is probably what you'll spend most of your time doing in watercolor. You'll have wet or fluid paint in your brush. The paper will be dry and you'll have a good amount of control. When you put the paint onto the paper, it stays where you breathe. It doesn't float around and spread around like it did in the sky. It stays there. So you can be really neat and exact. Stay inside the lines if you want to. Okay, so there we are. There's the distant hill. Just dropping a couple of spots of Payne's Grey along the top. And again, it's dried. And you can see now that it's dried much paler than when it went on. That's something you'll come to learn with watercolor. Now, the distant hill has to be dry here, because when we paint this second hill next to it, if the distant hill was still wet, it would be like the sky. And as soon as we touched this grey colour into the distant blue, it would just spread in like the sky did, which we don't want in this case. So here we are, wet on dry. We've got some nice control. The paint is quite thick at this point. There's quite a lot of pigment. And I put in a little bit of extra water in. So as we move down the hill, the strength of the paint gets lower. It gets lighter. There's more water. There's less pigment. And in effect, what we're doing here is a kind of a bonus technique, in that it's called a wash. Where you start off with a dark colour at the top, and it eventually becomes lighter as you go to the bottom. think it's called a variegated wash, but it's a technique that you'll see a lot of times in paintings. Okay, second hill done, and now we can move on to the third one, and we just repeat the process. You can see the one on the left as it's drying. It's still wet in the shot. You can see as it's drying already, the bottom section is becoming much paler because we had much less pigment in it. And you can see on the right hand side as I'm applying that, it's wet. You can see how wet it is. So because it's wet, it goes on really nicely and smooth. Now we've got a little bit more water in, just like we did on the left hand side. So we're getting a gradation as we move down the hill from dark colour to light colour. This is a mix of the blue and the grey. And there we go. I'm not too concerned about going over a couple of those lines because I'll be painting over those later. Now that piece of card that just popped up was me testing the dryness of my brush, because here we are now on fundamental technique number 3. We've got some dry paint onto dry paper, dry on dry, or dry brush as people tend to call it. And as you can see, I'm not using the tip of the brush, I'm using the side of the brush. The paint it's not strictly dry, obviously, it's watercolor, so there is some water in it, but it's the minimum amount of water you can get, and it's referred to as dry. And what happens is you just drag your brush, the side of your brush, across the surface of the paper. And it's the texture of the paper that picks up tiny amounts of paint from your brush. Some people call it drag brush, dry on dry. It's the third technique. It's not that common. It's quite a specialised technique. The wet on wet for the sky and the wet on dry for the hills are the two most common things that you'll ever do. Probably 90% of the time you'll be doing one of those two. This one's a little bit more specialised. Don't worry about the surface of the water, the lake. We'll come back to that. But that was dry on dry. And you get this nice broken edge, which in this case is representing the glittering light on the surface of the lake. So I switched to the lake rather than continue with the hills because I wanted the previous hill to be fully dry before I did the next one. And for the same reason, I've now switched into the foreground. I've still got one hill left to do, but I'm switching into the foreground so that the fourth hill can fully dry before I tackle the last one. So, yeah, we're now on the foreground and I've got dark colour here. It's probably pure Payne's grey at this point. There's no blue mixed into it. And I'm just doing a very simple foreground silhouette. Just block it in as quickly as you can. I could probably use a bigger brush here, but I wanted to stick with just 3 brushes, because as a beginner, you don't need that many. Okay, we'll let that dry for a bit, and we'll go back to the 5th hill. And it's the same colour as the foreground, which is possibly a mistake. It should have been slightly lighter than the foreground, I think. Can you see on the 2 fairly distant hills, well, the 3 distant hills, with the dark at the top and the light underneath? As the paint's dried, you've got these lovely little spidery patterns appearing, which are kind of like random textures on the side of a hill that you would actually see. We didn't plan those, they just happened. Okay, here we are, we're back in the foreground, and I've got a little stick here, it's a cocktail stick or something like that, and I'm just dragging out some of the wet paint on the top of the hill, top of the foreground hill that is, to represent grass. And now we're back to the surface of the lake for the fourth fundamental, which is glazing. Now, glaze is a very thin coat of paint, much more water than pigment. And I'm using a wide-ish flat brush. It's about 1/2 inch, I think, that one, and I'm just backwards and forwards I go. So this represents the actual blue sky reflecting in the waters of the surface of the lake. I'm trying to leave a tiny white line along the horizon, because that's often what you see when you look at a distant lake. You get the darker colours nearer to you. I'm also trying to leave some white bits at random, although biased towards the centre of the painting, to represent some light on the lake, and possibly also a reflection of the area of white cloud that we see above it. There we are. It's all done. 4 techniques in just over 10 minutes with just 2 paints and 3 brushes. I hope you found that useful, and you'll join me very soon for another watercolour workshop.